The Butler family traced their ancestry to Theobald Fitzwalter, an Anglo-Norman knight from Norfolk, England. He was born around 1165. His ancestry has often been debated and speculated on, from being of Breton and Frankish to even Anglo-Saxon origin. One origin story even associates him as a descendant of one of the knights who accompanied William the Conqueror across the Channel and fought with him in 1066 at the Battle of Hastings, being granted Dereham in Norfolk for his services. Some sources point to him being the grandson of one Hervey Walter, who, in the time of Henry I, was Lord of Ormond in Lancaster, as well as holding lands in Suffolk and Norfolk. Like most occupational names, there are often multiple origin points for the name, with other English branches come from lines such as the Butlers of Warrington. There are also Butlers named on the Scottish Ragman Rolls of 1291, and a transaction record of a restoration of lands to a John Butler in 1296. Although there are multiple branches, the Butlers of Ireland generally descend from Theobald. Some exceptions include the Butlers of Banshire, who descend from Mora O'Brien. They became Butlers from his marriage to Eleanor Butler in 1690, although most Butlers can still count Theobald as an ancestor through paternal or maternal links. Theobald first arrived in Ireland in 1185 within the retinue of Prince John, Lord of Ireland. Theobald had been granted large tracts of land. He would also gain the hereditary office of the ceremonial cupbearer, or butler to Prince John. King Henry II of England would grant him the presarges of wine. By this grant, he took 2 barrels of wine out of every ship that harboured in a trading port of Ireland as tax. It was from this title which his descendants took their surname. I have another video discussing Theobald on my channel, featuring author Rua Butler. Should you wish to know more of Theobald's life in greater detail, please check out the video. The Butlers would spend their time establishing themselves within the lands they have been granted, often putting themselves in direct confrontation with the native Irish. Some of these families within the Butlers' earlier lands of Kilkenny included the O'Carrolls, O'Donohues, Dunphys, O'Ryans and Fitzpatricks. Theobald's grandson, also called Theobald, would marry Marjorie de Burgh. She brought more land to the Butlers, as well as the family's first links to the Irish nobility, as she was descended from the O'Briens of Thomond. His grandson, also called Theobald, would gain more lands in England through his marriage. It was around this time the family had become very active in supporting the English campaigns in Scotland during the Scottish Wars of Independence. Sir Edmund Butler of Ormond also raised an army of Munster and Leinster men in 1315 to fight against Edward the Bruce's invasion of Ireland. The family's continued support for the English monarchy no doubt helped Edmund's son James to become the first Earl of Ormond. With this, the Butlers also enjoyed palatine rights to the county of Tipperary until 1715. From the middle of the 14th century to the time just prior to Cromwell's confiscations, County Kilkenny and Tipperary came to be dominated by the Butler families, headed by the Earl of Ormond, who at different times had ruled from Nina, Carrick-on-Suir, and the most particularly from Kilkenny City. The Mountgarrett Butlers dominated along the strategic territories. Likewise, other key Ormond allies held frontier lands bordering the county, including the Graces, Purcells and the Cantwells. In addition, underneath the Butler overlordship, the head tenants on the individual manors were for the most part cadet branches of Butlers, or members of other leading landed families such as the Comerfords. The central lowlands of County Kilkenny were dominated by Anglo-Norman families, such as the Shorthalls, the St Ledgers and the Blanchfields. Other landed families who were tenants of the Butlers include the Forestalls, Fitzgeralds, Galls, Daltons, Dens and the Frennies. In 1391, James Butler, 3rd Earl of Ormond, and the cousin to King Richard II, purchased Kilkenny Castle from the Despencer family. Around this time, the Geraldines and the Butlers were also at each other's heels, vying for supremacy within Ireland's political landscape. As usual, conflict broke out, but in the 1390s it was markedly more intense. In 1396, Thomas Butler, brother to the 3rd Earl, was slain at Waterford by the Geraldines. Faced with a threat of retaliation from the Butlers, the 3rd Earl of Desmond agreed to pay some 800 marks in compensation. Later, during King Richard II's expedition to Ireland in 1399, the Earl of Ormond reputedly encouraged the king's men to expel the Geraldines from Dungarvan Castle. John, 4th Earl of Desmond, retaliated with an attack on the Butler stronghold of Cahir. Afterwards, uncle and nephew Ormond and Desmond came to terms and made peace. During the 100 Years' War in France, the Butlers played their part. The annals of Connacht state, Thomas Butler, son of the Earl of Ormond, went to England to help the King of England against the King of France, taking 18 score men with red shields and 18 score with pure white shields. Noble Gauls and Gaels, and not often has so numerous and so well born a host embarked from England. They devastated much of the land of France and won great ascendancy for the King of England. Unfortunately, the Earl of Ormond's son would die during this campaign. The French are also known to have commented on this particular campaign. In the Chronique of Monstrelet, they are described as ill-clothed, entirely undisciplined, and armed with strangely fashioned knives. They had but one shoe and stocking, the other leg being left bare, and those who were mounted rode without a saddle. They spread terror through the countryside, where they carried off men, women and children on the backs of stolen cows and sold them as slaves. James, the 4th Earl of Ormond, would see his sons become major players in the dynastic civil wars known as the War of the Roses. Being staunch Lancastrian supporters, his eldest was beheaded after the Battle of Towton in 1461. John Butler, his middle son, famously fought and lost at the Battle of Pilton in 1462 against the pro-Yorkist and long-time Butler rivals, the Fitzgeralds. This effectively ended Lancastrian hopes in Ireland and bolstered Fitzgerald's control for a further half-century. The Ormond branch of Butlers departed into exile, with John dying in the Holy Lands on his way to Jerusalem in 1478. The youngest son, Thomas Butler, was known as the Wool Earl due to his enormous wealth. Besides being in the possession of major lands in the Irish counties of Kilkenny and Tipperary, he owned 72 manors in England, making him one of the richest subjects in the realm and a close friend of King Henry VII. With this, he enjoyed vast privileges and titles within the English court and parliament. None of these men would have legitimate sons, so their titles passed to a distant cousin, Piers Butler, grandson of Edmund MacRichard Butler. Of the Poleston branch, he had adopted the Irish customs and the Gaelic title, the MacRichards of Ossory. He had supported John Butler in his campaign in support of House Lancaster in Ireland. In 1494, the English king created laws in Ireland to stop the Irish customs and clan fighting that had become adopted by even the English lords, including banning the clan war cries, such as the famous Butler Revolt. Should they need to shout something, they were permitted to invoke St. George or the King. The Fitzgerald and Butler families were ordered to keep the king's peace, and in 1496 a peace pact was signed between them, forgiving all past transgressions by both parties. Although this was a failure, as the rivalry between the families persisted well into the next century. The outside threat of the Fitzgeralds wasn't the only threat the Butlers had to contend with. The Butler family suffered from internal disorders, with branches of the family often at odds with each other. Piers Butler, 8th Earl of Ormond, received a pardon for crimes committed in Ireland, including the murder of his kinsman James Butler, heir to the 7th Earl. Piers's son James, also known as James Butler, 9th Earl of Ormond, was appointed as Lord Treasurer of Ireland by Henry VIII. He was held in high regard by Henry, and he was also given 7 religious houses on the dissolution of the monasteries. The manner of his death has often been debated, from poisoning to possible food poisoning. Whatever the cause, it took him 11 days to die after attending that supper at Ely House. In 1565, the Battle of Affane between the forces of Fitzgerald, Earl of Desmond, and the Butler, Earl of Ormond, took place. The battle ended in defeat and capture of the Desmond Earl after he was shot in the hip by Edmund Butler of Clochrennan. It was one of the last private battles fought in Britain or Ireland. Elizabeth I was furious that 2 noble houses had fought a private battle, defying the authority she claimed over the Kingdom of Ireland. The fact that both sides had displayed their banners in the battle was a particular affront to her. The Earl of Ormond was a cousin and a favourite of the Queen, resulting in only the Earl of Desmond being arrested for the battle. In 1569, we saw the rising of the North in England, an attempt by Catholic nobles from Northern England to depose Queen Elizabeth and replace her with Mary, Queen of Scots. At the same time, we saw the first Desmond Rebellion by the Earl of Desmond. The rebellion was motivated primarily by the desire to maintain the independence of feudal lords from their monarch. The Earl had also spent 7 years in the Tower of London for the Battle of Affane, an event that no doubt embittered him towards the Queen. The rebellion also had elements of religious antagonism between Catholic Geraldines and the Protestant English. But also, in the same year, we had the Butler Revolt, led by Sir Edmund Butler of Clochrennan. Edmund's rebellion was a direct response to the Lord Deputy of Ireland, Sir Henry Sidney, who had granted Edmund's lands to Sir Peter Carey. Edmund fought alongside his brothers Edward and Pierce. The brothers responded by raiding English settlements up and down the breadth of Leinster and were declared traitors by Sidney. Eventually, Edmund's brother, the Earl of Ormond, fearing for the future of his lands and titles, responded by joining his enemy Sidney and marched against Edmund. He was imprisoned in Dublin Castle, but with the help of Fair MacHugh O'Byrne, he escaped. Following his escape from Dublin, Edmund regained control of Clochrennan once more. However, his holdings were in a ruinous state, and he never lived there again. His brothers had remained with the Desmond rebels. Edmund had managed to evade capture until his death. The 10th Earl also supported the Crown during the Tyrone Rebellion, also known as the 9-Year War. His assistance was limited due to his advanced age, but his kin, the Butlers of Cahir, had sided with Hugh O'Neill against England. During the ongoing plantations of Ireland, many Catholic families were forced to give up their lands to make way for the settlement of settlers coming to Ireland from England, Scotland and Wales. The Butlers were no different. One such family were the Butlers of Ballinakil Castle. Like so many dispossessed Irishmen in the 17th century, they soon found themselves in the employ as soldiers in the armies of Europe, often known as wild geese. Walter Butler of Ballinakil Castle was a military officer who served as a colonel in the Imperial Army of the Habsburg Emperor Ferdinand II. He served with distinction in the 30 Years' War and famously took part in the assassination of Generalissimo Albrecht von Wallenstein. For this, he was awarded the title of Count and was given Heimhassen Castle, where his descendants took the surname Butler von Kronberg. By the time of the War of the Three Kingdoms in 1639, the Kilcash branch of the Butlers were now the senior line. James Butler, 1st Duke of Ormond, was raised a Protestant due to his father's untimely death. It often meant that he was at odds with much of his family and dependents, especially as they suffered from land confiscations and legal discrimination on the account of their religion, while he did not. The Duke's friend, Wentworth, planned large-scale confiscations of Catholic-owned land, both to raise money for the Crown and to break up the political power of the Irish Catholic gentry, a policy which Ormond himself supported, yet it infuriated his relatives and drove many of them into opposition of Wentworth and ultimately into armed rebellion. On the outbreak of the Irish Rebellion of 1641, Ormond found himself in command of the Irish Royal Army, based in Dublin. Most of the country was taken by the Catholic rebels, who included Ormond Butler's relatives. However, Ormond's bonds of kinship were not entirely severed. His wife and children were escorted from Kilkenny to Dublin under the order of the rebel leader, Richard Butler, 3rd Viscount of Montgarret. The English Civil War, started in September 1642, had removed the prospect of more reinforcements and supplies from England for the Earl's army. The King had also desired to recall troops from Ireland. In addition, the Scottish Covenanters, who had landed an army in the northeast of Ireland at Carrickfergus to counter the Catholic rebellion in that part of the country, had subsequently put the northeast of Ireland on the side of the English parliamentarians. The Earl, isolated in Dublin in what was now a three-sided contest, with the King desiring to reduce the Irish Royal Army, the Earl negotiated a ceasefire with the Irish Confederates. Eventually, Ormond judged that he could no longer hold Dublin against the Confederates. He handed over Dublin, together with 3,000 Royalist troops under his command, to the parliamentarian commander Michael Jones, who had recently arrived from England with 5,000 soldiers. He is said to have remarked that he preferred English rebels to Irish ones. In order to avoid arrest by the Parliament, he joined the Queen and the Prince of Wales at Paris. On the execution of King Charles I, he proclaimed his loyalty to Charles II, who made him a Knight of the Garter. Ormond was then placed in command of the Irish Confederate armies and also the English Royalist troops, who were landed in Ireland from France. However, despite controlling almost all of Ireland before August 1649, Ormond was unable to prevent the conquest of Ireland by Cromwell. The Butlers of Anna under Cromwell were banished to Connacht in 1653. On the return of Charles II to England as King, Ormond was appointed a Commissioner for the Treasury and the Navy, along with the return of much of his estates. After Charles II's death, Ormond's last act as Lord Lieutenant was to proclaim James II in Dublin. He died in 1688, and his grandson James II, Duke of Ormond, took the title. During the Williamite Wars in Ireland, James voted against the motion to put William of Orange and Mary on the throne, and against the motion to declare that James II had abdicated it. Nevertheless, he subsequently joined the forces of William of Orange. James was made Colonel of the Queen's troops of Horse Guards. He accompanied William in his Irish campaign, arriving with him in Carrickfergus in 1690. He also commanded his troops at the Battle of the Boyne in that same year in July. After their campaign in Ireland, he joined William of Orange during the 9 Years' War, having been promoted to Major General. Although he finally chose to support the Williamites, many of his kin did not. Here is a list of the Butler Jacobites of the County Kilkenny and Upper Ossory. After the death of King William and Queen Mary, his cousin Piers Butler, 3rd Viscount and Galmoyle, and himself supported the Jacobite Rising of 1715. His estates were forfeited, but Parliament passed an act to enable his brother Charles Butler, 1st Earl of Arran, to purchase his estates, which he accordingly did. Although he also died without male heir, and the line would move across to the Garry-Ricken line of the family. Other branches had started to move to places such as America. Like other Irish families, due to religious discrimination or warfare, some of these families made huge impacts, including during the American Revolutionary War or the American War of Independence. John Butler was a loyalist who led an irregular militia unit known as Butler's Rangers on the northern frontier in New York during the American Revolutionary War. Although forever associated with the Cherry Valley Massacre, he was seen as an intelligent and capable leader of men. Also, Richard Butler was an officer in the Continental Army during the American Revolutionary War. His 4 other brothers also served and were noted for their bravery being given the nickname the Fighting Butlers. Other branches would stay closer to home and make their impact there. Many more butlers would continue to distinguish themselves from the charities they founded, or as soldiers, politicians, or within the arts, which continues right up to the modern day. Thank you for watching. I will do a video on the branches of this massive family in the future. Should you wish to learn more about this amazing family's history, please check out the Butler Society, a society created to connect and preserve the Butlers' history. I'll leave a link below. Thank you to all my Patreons, and please like and subscribe if you wish to learn more about the families of Ireland, Scotland and more.